Well, good afternoon and welcome to this edition of No Cap Sports and how we're going to learn about legal education today, protecting your name, your image, and your likeness. We have with us today a very, very special guest by the name of Luke Fetlam. So I'll let Luke talk about more about his career, but I want to just kind of give him his due first and foremost. So went to Wake Forest, got his JD from Ohio State University. Spent some time in the armed services, so we appreciate your service there. He's also a partner with Porter Wright currently, and also a founder of Anomaly Sports Group, and does a lot of live presentations all over the country as well as virtually. So we're so excited to have you on this morning, or this afternoon rather, and thank you for joining us.
Will, thank you so much for having me. That's a lot. That was a mouthful that you just shared about me, so I appreciate that. But no, this is exciting. Excited to have this conversation with you.
Absolutely, absolutely. So just kind of jumping into it. So I want to kind of take a kind of left turn and we'll come back on course. But given all that you do, how do you balance it? I think time management is a big thing for student athletes in the new era they're in. So they have classes, they have athletics, and now they're on top of the NIL. And so as someone that's been busy and is very busy, how do you manage your time? And then we'll kind of shift to the conversation.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot of times I don't think of it as work-life balance. I think of it as work-life integration. And I think about what are ways in which I can integrate various aspects of my life. So, for example, I'm a father. I've got an 11-year-old son, a 7-year-old daughter. And this idea of balance would mean that I sleep for 8 hours, I work for 8 hours, and I spend 8 hours with my family, right? I mean, that would be balance. And that's just so not realistic, right? So I try to find ways in which I can bring my family into the work that I do sometimes. But ultimately, I think as we think about for student athletes, it's really about figuring out what are you prioritizing? And when you're prioritizing and you're putting something kind of first in your life, like, are you all in on it? So when I'm with my kids, when I go home and I'm with my kids, I try to be all in, like in that time. I mean, as much as they actually want to hang out with me or not, right? Like if they want to hang out with me, I'm all in and leave work aside, right? And then once they go to sleep or whatever, maybe then I'm right back up on the laptop, doing work and that kind of thing. But the same thing for my wife. Been married for 14 years, continuing to try to stay married. So I got to prioritize my time, with her. But then also we know work, has its priority times, right? Where you have to focus or travel or things along those lines. So for student athletes, it's about, you're going to have these ebbs and flows within your schedule. And so thinking about, what are those priority times of studying for preparing for finals or midterms or what have you, or a paper that has to get written, thinking about what are the crazy busy times of your season. And then thinking about what are you agreeing to in a contract for name, image, and likeness. And is it going to require you to provide services during your busy time? So understanding that allows you to start to prioritize it, because it's so impossible for us to truly find balance, but we can find ways that we can kind of integrate things together appropriately so that we can prioritize and move forward.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for the answer. And you mentioned one piece of the DDMC model that we'll get into today, and that piece was contracts. So if I got this right, DDMC is due diligence, decision-making, money, and contracts. Is that correct?
That is. Now, I usually flip those D's around. So I usually go decision-making, due diligence, money, contracts.
All right.
And it's kind of because it flows a little bit, right? You go through a decision-making process, and that allows you to get into due diligence and start thinking about money and ultimately the contracts you're going to sign. But yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. So just kind of walk us through. I know we're not bringing in for a live session, as of yet, but I want to kind of talk about that. So when you mention decision making, so obviously, okay, well, you have opportunities. So here's a partner, a potential company sponsor that I could work with. Here's another one. Here's another one. How do I prioritize? I mean, what decision to make and who to work with if they're all kind of in competing categories? Like, how do we start the decision making process, and how multifaceted is that?
Wow. So it's incredibly multifaceted when it comes to name, image, and likeness, right? I mean, that is, I think, something that a lot of people don't realize, right? Which is when I think about name, image, and likeness, I'm thinking about all of these things that you just mentioned. I'm thinking about the opportunity that's presenting itself to me. I'm thinking about the people that are presenting it to me. Do I trust them? Do I not? Do I want to do something that they bring to me? Is this an opportunity that fits in with my kind of authentic self or my brand or who I want to be seen as or portrayed as, right? Like, and then it's like, do the terms make sense for me? Is it something that I feel like is going to benefit me, and kind of the why I'm getting involved in name, image, like all of these things come. And I know a lot of times when we talk to student athletes, they'll say things like, when you think about name, image, and likeness, what do you think of? Usually the first answer is money, right? but it goes to be so much more than just money. And that's why having a process, thinking about your decisions, it's an important first step when you're kind of navigating this name, image, and likeness environment.
Okay, very good. So when you go from the decision-making process, so I've made this decision, I'm going to work with this company, Banana Technologies, right? You're going to make banana peels and sell them for a lot of money. So that's our first kind of first step. We made that decision. Next, we're going into our due diligence. And so what's due diligence look like for someone considering an opportunity or a partnership?
Yeah, first, I think it's important just to understand what due diligence is, right? And that's just being able to investigate or analyze an opportunity or a brand or a company. And so when you think about that, okay, so if, banana company comes and wants you to do something, right? Who is this company, right? I mean, and here's something to think about for name, image, and likeness. You really have to do due diligence on companies because, is it a legitimate company? Is it a company that, is going to actually pay you for the services that you provide? And so making sure that you kind of have a process and thinking around how am I going to investigate? How am I going to analyze the various companies that want to come and work with me, or the various people, advisors, marketing agents, anyone else, right? Accountants, attorneys, whatever it might be. How do I kind of analyze and investigate who they are so that I can make sure that I'm not getting into a situation where I might be taken advantage of?
Absolutely. So you talk about fake companies, mean like a Bishop Sycamore could be one of those type of companies, right? Just somebody just has an idea.
That's pretty close to home, man. That's pretty close to home. I'm here in Columbus, Ohio, man.
Shots fired. I'm sorry, man. So we're into decision making. That's the first one. Now we've talked about due diligence and really being investigative in that process. Now moving on to the money portion of it, where the money resides. Talk to us about money. How do we go about one? I guess how should we look at money first and foremost, and then the acquisition part of it as it relates to the contracts that we may be looking at.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that there's no one way to look at money. It's important for you to just understand, how do you look at money, right? If you understand how you look at money, you can start to put in kind of guardrails so that you can make, again, going back to decision making, you can make smart decisions about how you're going to manage and deal with kind of the money side of name, image, and likeness. We know that taxes are an issue, right? I mean, that's no surprise to anyone. It shouldn't come as a surprise because enough people are talking about that you're going to have to pay taxes. So having a plan for that. But it's not just about saying, okay, I'm going to set money aside for taxes and then I can go spend the rest. It's like, do you want to be in a situation where you have a plan for your money for, whatever deals you do? Maybe you say, okay, I'm going to set money aside for taxes and then I'm going to come up with a plan to save a portion and, have another portion that's available to spend, whatever that might be for you. Being able to think through what that plan is that works for you, that you can stay true to, that you can be held accountable towards. That's something I think that's important when it comes to money and making sure that you have, just that solid plan for where to go and how to treat the money.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. How to treat the money. Exactly. That's a great point. And so when you think about, money and contracts, you talk about taxes. So kind of talk to us about that. What does that kind of look like for a student athlete that may be, getting financial compensation as far as, do I get a DBA? Do I need an LLC? Do I file an S Corp? What's kind of a general process to help our student athletes?
Yeah. So that starts to get really complex. Thinking about kind of entity structure. The first step I think that's important from a legal perspective is just making sure that you understand what it is that you're signing before you sign, right? I mean, that's, if I could, say that 1,000,000 times for the next, however long we're together, like I would, right? It's kind of that important, right? Know what it is that you're signing before you sign. I just had a conversation with a group of student athletes earlier today. And I asked them, how many people have signed a contract for NIL? And, about 30 to 40% of them raised their hands. And I said, I asked, one was kind of sitting by where I was standing. I said, so, what was that like for you? What did you think about? Kind of what was that like when you got the contract and everything? He's like, well, I just went into the business and they just had me sign the contract. And I was like, did you read it? And he was like, no. And I was like, I love your honesty. I love your openness. But there are some challenges with that, right? And let's talk about why you should actually read it. Now, I know that contracts can be filled with legalese. Sometimes they can be long and potentially confusing. But you want to make sure that you at least have an understanding of what it is that you're signing before you actually sign, because you're agreeing to do something. And you don't have the opportunity to be able to raise your hand and say, hey, I'm sorry, I'm a student athlete. I didn't know what I was signing. I don't really want to do this anymore. because as long as you're 18 years old or older, you're of the age of majority and you've signed this contract, it's a legally binding agreement. And to the point of DBAs or LLCs, that gets very much, it becomes a case-by-case basis, right? There are some instances where an LLC, which is a limited liability company, might make sense. It provides some liability protection. It may help from an expense management perspective in terms of writing off some expenses. But, that's really a matter of understanding the situation you find yourself in as it relates to name, image, and likeness, the opportunities that you have, and then having conversations with, qualified advisors to help you work through what's the best kind of legal structure for you.
Absolutely. So just based on your experience and some of the student athletes that you worked with and your live sessions and otherwise, give us kind of a case study. So and I mean to preface with this. So the vast majority of student athletes are going to have to be in some ways creative in order to generate income. There are some that are going to get the cash deals, what have you. But in terms of creativity, what have you seen out in the marketplace, and what do you encourage student athletes to do if they do want to participate in NIL but may not have the so-called following or engagement or things like that? What would you encourage? What have you seen out there?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost is just being authentic, right? You got to have almost a conversation with yourself, right? To understand, what is it that I'm trying to achieve? Why do I want to be involved in name, image, and likeness, right? If it's just for money, then it's important for you to understand that you're doing this just for money. But even then, if you dig deeper, we all have reasons that we would do something for money, things that we would do, things that we wouldn't do, right? So how do you want your brand to be reflected in the marketplace? Thinking about whether you, are going to be applying for grad school or going into the working world or potentially playing professional sports. People are going to be analyzing and evaluating you for opportunities. And so what is that brand? If someone were to Google you or to do research on you, do their own due diligence on you, what is it that they're going to find? And is that an accurate reflection of what you want out in the marketplace? And as you think about, your authentic self and everything, one of the things that I think, that we talk about with student athletes is, the best way to describe it is, I've had some conversations with various business owners, right? And business owners, that get name, image, and likeness. There are a few very, very large companies, national and global type of companies, where I've talked to senior marketing people there, chief marketing officers, et cetera. And they talk about how they know that they have the resources to be able to go out and get any type of celebrity social media influencer that they want. But what they want is authenticity. They want, so as an example, a company, I used to work at Scott's Miracle-Gro, and I was talking to some folks over there on the marketing side, and they said, they've had Super Bowl commercials for the past number of years. They get some of the biggest names, but when they think about name, image, and likeness, they think about who are the student athletes that had a lawn care business when they were in high school, right? Cutting grass, or who, maybe painted lines in their backyard to try to make a football field, or things like that. People who cared about their little plot of earth, if you will, right? And that translates to the brand itself. So thinking about that authentically as a student athlete, think about those things that you've done, those things that either that you enjoy doing or that you've done in the past, or things even that have affected you, right? Because there are nonprofits that are doing NIL deals with student athletes. And if you think about the causes that are meaningful to you, there could be nonprofits out there who would be more than willing to do a deal with a student athlete. And we've seen some of those, to, go back to that creative side. A lot of times people think about name, image, and likeness as this traditional sports marketing that we've seen historically at the professional level. But name, image, and likeness is the opportunity for student athletes to be able to contract with a third party for their benefit, right? And get paid for it. And so it doesn't have to be that traditional, to your point of a student athlete saying, like, I don't really have that much of a following, or I don't know that I want to do social media influencing. Great. You can do camps and clinics in your sport where you're teaching young people in your hometown. There are a lot of different things that you can do to engage in name, image, and likeness. You could start a podcast. You could have a YouTube page that now you can get paid for. Instead of it being an NCAA violation, you actually make money off of it. So there are a lot of different ways to be creative when it comes to name, image, and likeness. It doesn't have to be, kind of our traditional notions of what NIL, should be.
Absolutely. Wow. And so just kind of staying with that same conversation, just getting into the different structures we talked about, and the entity has to make sense. there are some student athletes I've talked to and work with that are interested in starting nonprofits. So can you talk to us about the structure of a nonprofit and just kind of how that works in that kind of grand marketplace?
Yeah, so a nonprofit is basically it's an entity that ultimately applies for nonprofit or tax exempt status. So the very kind of high level, simple process is you first have to establish a nonprofit corporation. Once you have that nonprofit corporation established, that's with a state. So either whatever state you're in or whatever state you desire that nonprofit to be established in, you file for nonprofit corporation, and then you would get a tax ID number. You would have bylaws for your nonprofit corporation. You would register with the attorney general within your particular state, because all states have an attorney general requirement for registration of nonprofits for charitable solicitation, which means you going out and raising funds for whatever that particular cause is. And then once you have those things established, then you can apply for your 501c3 status, right? So at that point, then you would there's a form called a 1023, and there's a couple versions of it, a 1023 or a 1023 EZ. The threshold question is, do you have plans to raise over $50,000 in any of the first 3 years? And if the answer is no, which I would assume most student athletes, the answer is going to be no, then you can file the EZ form, which is 1023 EZ. And that's basically asking for, what's the charitable purpose? Do you have bylaws? What's the tax ID number? Who are the directors? Because you have to have a board of directors. Most states, a minimum of 3 on your board of directors. And you provide all that information. You pay the filing fee, send it to the IRS. And with the EZ form, usually within, the IRS is a bit backed up right now, but usually within like 8 to 10 weeks, you'll hear back from the IRS with a determination on your tax exempt status. Once you have that letter, that's what says if someone donates to your nonprofit, then they can receive that charitable contribution, or that charitable deduction rather, on their taxes. And that sets you up with tax exempt status.
Absolutely. Wow. So to that end, when you talk about the tax exempt status, and there were some changes, some tax law changes that, you're more well versed than I am when it came to donors, making contributions to universities and their write-offs and things like that, deductions. So in your just, honest opinion, or in your expert knowledge, what do you kind of see the effect of donors or boosters transferring money into the hands of student athletes through special interest groups or things that even being set up by the university? And what's that kind of, dichotomy look like in your purview for the long-term success of the universities themselves and even the student athletes? What's that look like?
I mean, I think, to be honest with you, I think this is something that is, it's a state by state, school by school situation right now. Name, image, and likeness is different. The policies are different at different schools. There are some schools that have language that discuss donors and boosters, et cetera, and their involvement or their restrictions on involvement for name, image, and likeness. I think in terms of what does the future kind of look like, I think this is something that will be in some form or fashion addressed in federal legislation. When we think about federal legislation creating a national standard for name, image, and likeness, we're likely to see some language about that, right? Because if we think about it from a equitable competition perspective, if you've got schools with hundreds of thousands of alumni and donors and things like that, obviously there's a benefit, right, for their boosters, et cetera, to be involved in the amount of money that can be raised and created for student athletes. So there's going to be something done there, but it'll be interesting to see what it is, because ultimately the other piece is, what better group would you have to get student athletes involved in name, image, and likeness and opportunities, than your alumni, or than, boosters, people who believe in the program, who want to see the program succeed. So they want to give, provide opportunities to student athletes. But at the same time, it's just a recipe for, people taking advantage of or gaming the system and trying to get a competitive advantage by that. So that's a tough question to answer, but I think that it's going to be something that's probably going to be addressed as we look at, a national standard that comes through federal legislation.
Oh, very good. So as we kind of continue our conversation, we've talked about a lot of different things. We talked about decision making, we talked about the due diligence, money, and we kind of took a small detour, talked about entities and nonprofit structures and taxable and charitable donations. I wanted to kind of come back to that DDMC model and kind of close the gap here and just talk about contracts and understanding that there's a lot of legalese in these contracts that student athletes may skip over. But what are kind of some, what's the stuff in bold that we should actually take a look at and stop and actually read? And what should they be looking for in these contracts?
Yeah. So as much as I want to say read every word, I know that isn't always the case. So, you want to take special attention to certain areas. You've got to know what services you're providing. I mean, that's just kind of the bottom line. You got to know what it is that you're being asked to do, because that's what you're going to be held accountable towards. You've got to understand compensation and how compensation works, right? I mean, what are you getting paid? When are you getting paid? How are you getting paid? You've got to understand that piece. You got to know how long the term of the contract is. So how long am I agreeing to do this? And then you got to understand, how are they going to use your intellectual property? I mean, ultimately, your name, your image, your likeness, right? How are they going to use that? Because ultimately, that's what name, image, and likeness is. It's you licensing the use of your name, image, and likeness for compensation. And so part of that contract is you agreeing to license that. So you need to make sure that you understand how are they going to use it, so that you're before you sign it, and you understand and you agree to the ways in which they're going to use your intellectual property.
Very good. Awesome. And so in the context of all of this, I think you mentioned it in a previous response, you talked about brand alignment and when people Google you and what they see and what comes up. So how does one, in your honest opinion, how do they build a brand? How do they have that brand consistency and frequency and those different things? What's kind of the best way for them to build their brands in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question for me because I'm not a brand expert, right? I don't, my focus is on protecting brands through legal means, through, education that we share with student athletes across the country. But I can share with you some of the things that I've seen is that you have to decide what you want your brand to be. I mean, that's kind of the first step. Like, what is it that you want your brand to be? And that doesn't mean you have to, go out and be a social media influencer. Right. It's about you being authentically you. And if social media just isn't your thing, that's fine. Right. And you can build your brand in different ways. I've talked with student athletes that have some that have created like video blogs or that have, created websites and things like that. Like, you don't have to be a social media influencer to establish your brand. I am most definitely not a social media influencer. You can look at my number of followers on social media. That is not my thing. But I've built a strong professional brand based on the involvement that I have in different things that matter to me. And I think as you think about who you are authentically, that's probably the first step in establishing your brand. You got to understand, what do I want my brand to be? I want my brand to be that when someone says, hey, have you heard about Luke Fedlam? They say, oh, absolutely. Like, he cares about protecting athletes. He wants to make sure that people are educated. He's unbiased. He's fair in what he does, and he's going to work his butt off for you. So, thinking I had to censor myself for a quick second. But that's what I want people to say, right? And so the things that I do every single day are to build that type of brand. And I think as student athletes, we have to think about that same thing of like, what is it that you want your brand to be? Maybe it's I want my brand to be that person is a great student who cares about these causes. Okay, if that's the case, then what are those things that you're doing to be able to establish that brand?
Absolutely.
People want the brand to be like, yo, this person is hilarious. They're the jokester on the team, right? They're the one that's always doing funny stuff or whatever, right? Like, I mean, know who you are and build your brand around it.
Absolutely. I love to get different people's aspects or different insights on that. And Jeff Bezos once said that your brand is what people say about you when you're not in the room. So like you said, I mean, if you're going to be the funny person, if you're going to be the studious person, I mean, be that person consistently and on a frequent basis, and you'll become known for it over time. So I wanted to kind of talk as we get ready to kind of come down the home stretch. When we talk about, brands and different partnerships and things like that, or even camps and clinics that student athletes may be running on their own, obviously they can, wait until the following year, they'll get the 1099 and pay their taxes all at once. But talk us about, taxes in general and, tax brackets and paying on a quarterly basis versus paying annually. Can you kind of dive into that a little bit, please?
Sure. So this is, taxes becomes a very challenging topic, and challenging in different ways, because we could talk about tax brackets. That's a bit challenging. There's different factors that come into play, especially when you think about the state taxes that also can get layered in. So when you think about it, when you do work, you're going to have city, state, and federal taxes, right? And now there may not be state tax depending on where you're located, but the bracket piece becomes interesting. The idea is that based on what you make, that's where your tax, that's where your tax rate will be based on. But one of the things for student athletes to really think about is, and I encourage this all the time, is you've got to have conversations with your parents too. Because if your parents are claiming you on their taxes, that can have an effect on whether or not you're filing taxes or not, and what that all looks like. So you have to have that conversation, especially if you are planning to file taxes based on what you've made. Your parents need to understand that too. So that conversation, I think, first and foremost is an important one to have. Beyond that, taxes, the simple part about taxes is just remembering you have to pay them. Like, if you're getting paid, you've got to pay your taxes. You've got to set money aside so that you're prepared to pay your taxes. The IRS will find you. They don't play. Like, no matter where you're going, they will find you. And here's something to think about. By not paying your taxes, you are setting yourself up. When we talked about brand and branding, like, not paying your taxes starts to go towards your brand of, are you responsible? Are you mature? How are you handling, your various professional matters? So again, all of this stuff fits together, but with taxes, set money aside, have a plan for paying your taxes, and make sure that you talk to your parents as well.
Very good. That's actually, I've been a part of a lot of conversations, and as obvious as it should be, it's my first time hearing about having the conversation with your parents, because you're getting those benefits. And wow, yeah, that was very insightful for me. So I appreciate that. Yeah. As we get ready to just kind of wrap up here, I wanted to just kind of hear more about, we've talked about the different elements that, you present in your different workshops, but can you talk to us about Anomaly and the work you do with Team Ultimus and kind of those aspects, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So we met Team Ultimus a couple of years ago, I guess, almost a couple of years ago now. We just ended up being at the same conferences. I think the Black Student Athlete Summit at University of Texas was kind of one of the first ones where we met, and just realized, like, wow, like, we both care about providing unbiased, qualified education. And, in doing that, it's like you realize, like, oh, wow, you guys talk about this from a money perspective. We kind of talk about it from a contract, a legal perspective. Like, this just makes perfect sense. And so when we provide DDMC, decision-making, due diligence, money and contracts, education, we call that protective education. Education is going to protect student athletes. And as a side note, it's also education that's going to protect athletic administrators as well, right? We have a lot of conversations with staff, with coaches, ADs, just around this education, because schools are in a position where they can't advise a student athlete on whether or not they should do a deal. And so, what you can talk to student athletes about is reinforcing processes. So when we talk about all those different areas of DDMC, we get into and dive deeper into processes that can help student athletes navigate those areas, and work with staff and athletic administrators, coaches, so that they understand those processes, so that they can help reinforce and be a resource for student athletes. But our relationship with Team Ultimus is fantastic, because we share that same kind of educational philosophy, right? I firmly believe, and I know Team Ultimus does as well, that real world practical education is an ethical imperative for student athletes, right? And so to be able to deliver on that every day, that's why I think I got the best job in the world. We was just talking about that earlier, right? We get to work with young people who have ideas, who want to make change, who really are the first class of student athletes to have this opportunity to make money off of their name, image, and likeness. So I count it an honor to be able to even work with schools and to work with student athletes, to be able to share this education, because I know that this education is meaningful, impactful, and applicable education that student athletes can put to work for them every single day. And whether or not a student athlete wants to engage in name, image, and likeness or not, the education that we provide helps them, even if they're, talking about decision making, even if you're making a decision as to whether I'm going to go to grad school or if I'm going to enter the workforce. Having a process for how you make decisions in life is helpful. So this education is going to be helpful for for all student athletes, regardless of whether they want to get involved in name, image, and likeness. And the last thing I'll say on that is one of the things, sometimes you may not have a plan to get involved in NIL, but NIL can find you. So you might have an amazing play, a viral moment, right? Or something where you just absolutely kind of kill it in your sport. And all of a sudden, the entire world kind of collapses on you to say, hey, we want you to do this, or we want you to do that. And while you thought, I'm not really going to engage in name, image, and likeness, now people are coming at you to engage and making offers to you, then you might want to be involved. And so having that education helps set you up for when those moments occur as well.
Absolutely. Wow. And as we kind of just talk about just the totality of name, image, and likeness and everything that you shared, just as we kind of ready to close out, tell us, is there anything that you just want to share with student athletes, just, in general that we maybe not covered? So any kind of final thoughts or closing words you want to share?
Sure, absolutely. And again, Will, I appreciate the time. Appreciate No Cap, for having me on and having this conversation. I think it's very needed. The one thing that I would say is, as a student athlete, you're an amateur athlete, but you are a professional business owner if you're engaging in name, image, and likeness. And so remembering that, right? Remembering that with, business opportunities come business responsibilities, and making sure that you are being responsible about this business now that's happening around you with name, image, and likeness. So whether you're thinking about the decisions now that you have to make, or doing due diligence on companies who want to work with you or people who want to work with you, understanding how you're going to manage this money now that you'll have the opportunity to earn, and knowing through contracts what it is that you're agreeing to, this is very important. This is managing your business. If you want to be that athlete CEO, you've got to be able to do those business leadership things. That means educating yourself on all that's happening around you so that you can maximize this opportunity. Because ultimately, what I want to see are student athletes who end up in a better place when they leave college than when they started, and that name, image, and likeness plays a role in that benefit.
Absolutely. Luke, tell us where our listeners can find you. Where can they find you on social media, or lack thereof? Where can they find you? Where can they get in contact with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I said, I'm not a social media influencer. However, you can find me on social media at Luke Fedlam on pretty much every platform. You can find me on LinkedIn, Luke Fedlam. I have the benefit of a bit of a unique last name, so there aren't too many Fedlams out there. So you can pretty easily find me, or you can go to anomalysportsgroup.com about the work that we're doing at Anomaly, and also find my contact information there.
Absolutely, guys. So they are for hire. So you definitely want to get this guy on your campus, as well as Team Ultimus. And Mr. Fedlam, we thank you so much for your time today. So for No Cap Sports, my name is Will Baggett. It's Luke Fedlam. Thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Take care. Thanks.